Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining in, tuning in from your cars, from your telephones, from your laptops, and other screens and devices. Thank you very much for taking your time. Welcome to the community of practice of foundational learning. This is an ongoing community of practice. We've been doing this for the past year or so. We've been very, very fortunate to have speakers like Dr. Angeline and many, many others who volunteered their time and energy and their commitment and expertise with all of us to share with the community at GSF, which is across 64 countries. This is session 14. And please, I would ask you and request you if you could, in your chat box, in your names, if you could edit your names and add the organization as well, so that we have your name, but we also know where you're joining from. It just becomes easier for everyone to know who's in the room. Today, we will be conversing about literacy, languages, and foundational skills, and we'll be taking a conversation forward, which we had started much earlier on multilingualism last year with Luminous Fund, went to Spark, and they talked about their context on multilingual education. We've had several other sessions, including Dr. Barbara Tudell, and today Dr. Angeline Barrett from University of Bristol will converse about planning for transition, coherent curriculum design for multilingual education. We'll dive into what that is, what we'll be speaking about, but we're really grateful for your presence. It's a busy world out there. You must be coming in from somewhere. You will be going somewhere after this. So, in this time of 90 minutes, we'll really appreciate if you have everything else in terms of your notifications, mobile phones, other aspects where you're digitally or physically connected with others. If you could pause that and be fully here, that will always create magic. We will be recording the session as well. Many of you sometimes cannot attend, so we want to share this knowledge and this conversation with them as well. A bit about GSF, which many of you would be familiar with. Our vision is collective vision. All children can realize their potential through safe access to quality education. We are a growing global network. We are today 155 organizations across 60 countries, and collectively we serve 113 million plus children, 1.2 million plus schools, 1.2 million teachers are part of this collective network. It's really an immense opportunity to even understand and fathom. So the best thing is to collaborate, and share our learnings with each other. That's where communities of practice comes in. We believe in connections, peer learning, creating alignment on certain different aspects around foundational learning, child safeguarding, secondary education, and any other aspect which concerns the child and their learning. And contextualization. While whatever knowledge is shared over here, we understand that the contexts are beautifully complex and unique in every other part of the world. So how do we contextualize those learning as well? Without further ado, wanted to introduce Dr. Angeline and Barrett. Dr. Barrett is a professor in education at the University of Bristol, UK. Her interests include teacher professionalism and curriculum and pedagogy for lower secondary education. She's conducting a research in East Africa, Tanzania, specifically also on focusing on the transition from primary education and teacher education. And we've often talked about the importance of multilingualism in the primary years, but we've really not delved into the secondary years. So this is a great opportunity for us to do so. Before I hand it over to Dr. Angeline, we also had a small Slido, a few questions from you. So we wanted to understand a few questions and learn who is exactly in the room. So just give me a minute and I'll share that. You can maybe go into this QR code from your phone if you want, or through this, and then we'll start the slideshow where we'll have 3 questions for you. Great. Give me a thumbs up if you feel you've been able to access the Slido, either in the chat or like this. Perfect. Great. Let me stop share and And I hope you've come to the first question. Dr. Angeline, is my screen visible?
Yes, it is visible.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So yes, which level of education does your organization work with? Wanted to understand. Great. Kanupriya, if it's possible, on the chat box, if you could write your answer. Oh, working now. Great, perfect. Great, we have quite a diversity. Primary education up to grade 6, majority, then secondary, we have a number going up and down. So this just gives us an option of who's in the room, what's the opportunity out here. We will go into later breakouts as well. So, optimize the opportunity of conversing with each other around this as well. But the larger majority is up to grade 6, and then we have organizations serving other children as well. Perfect. We'll move to the next question. What language is mainly used for teaching and learning in secondary education in the country where you work? This is even if you're not running a secondary school. Great. Those who are adding none of the above, would it be possible to share in the chat box which country and exactly what languages are being used? That'll be really great to learn. Great. Somali, yes. Yes. Meg, thank you for sharing that. Stands out, you're one of the unique ones. And Dari and Pashto. Thank you, Liz. Great. Let's move to the next question. If you had to rank the quality issues around secondary education, one as being the most urgent, how would you rank the following? Great, we've got quite a poll. Does anyone want to unmute themselves and share any insights on the third question or any of the three questions before I hand it over to Dr. Angeline? Kanupriya, would you like to share it with the group?
Sure. Can you hear me? I'm using a different set of headphones today. So
we can.
Yeah, sure. I think the four equality issues that you've listed in your poll, they're very important in-school factors, supply side factors. But I think what I've seen in our work, and we work, although we don't work in secondary, we work mostly in the early years, even within the primary, it's mostly limited to early years, but we work with the system quite closely. So we are in about 800 schools in Tanzania and Dodoma, and we're in Ethiopia in one Wareda and Woliso, and now in Addis as well. We have programming in schools. The big problem we see is actually children are not even transitioning from primary to secondary. So there's a big cohort that just drops out. And I know that in Tanzania, language is a big reason for that. There's other out of school factors involved as well. But a lot of it is to do with not just literacy, but just readiness for secondary school. Children are leaving primary not ready for secondary schools.
That's so true. The around secondary education is first the entry to the secondary education in itself. Thank you very much for sharing this. Thank you very much. I'll hand it over to Dr. Angeline, and I know we'll have a lot of opportunity to dive into the Tanzanian context, but also your context as well, and learn more from each other. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Angeline.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can see those slides clearly. Thank you very much, Ajay, for that introduction. I think some of those issues we'll return to, and perhaps I'll be able to show you why some of the problems aren't lying exactly or only where we think they are lying with secondary education. First of all, to say, there we go, thank you. Just to say, mainly this presentation is based on research that we have done in Tanzania, very much we have done. So it's not just the University of Bristol, University of Dodoma has been doing actually most of the work for this research that I'm presenting here. I was hoping that do we have anyone from the University of Dodoma team here with us today? I know that we have, yes, Dr. Sane, Eliakim Sane is with us. So we may want to contribute to the presentation at stages. And John Clegg, who's with us, has also been very much involved in this research. And Zawadi Richard from St. John's University was involved in some earlier research. So if you want to delve into those reports a little bit more, I think Ajay was kind enough to circulate the links to them. And that's the link to the report, which is probably the easiest to read and look at. When it comes to talking about language and education and multilingual education, most of the emphasis has been on primary education. And so now we have quite a few fantastic examples around the world of L1-based multilingual education. And Barbara gave a very comprehensive presentation on this 2 months ago. And one of the kind of main conclusions that she came to from that, this is a picture of her slide, is that the feature that correlates to effective multilingual education programming every time was using the learner's L1 as the language of instruction throughout all of the primary grades. Once you have, I said I'd talk about language transition. Once you have a transition, so once you introduce a new language and start using it for learning and teaching, that transition in a sense never stops. And the languages that are most familiar to the learners continue to be an asset for learning. And I'm particularly been looking at secondary education, but there are people who've been looking at higher education. I think in the reference list at the end of this, I mentioned Colin Riley's work in Malawi. And basically they're finding that education, even formal education sites, continue to be multilingual right up to the level of higher education. So in a sense, our transition never stops. I think we can also say, we talk a lot about literacy in primary education, and we kind of assume that once you acquire literacy in primary education, that's it, you're now ready to go with the rest of your formal education. But of course, literacy acquisition is also an ongoing process. So you continue to develop more complex and advanced literacy skills as you progress through education, including forms of non-formal and informal education. And again, acquiring literacy skills in your L1 is then easier to transfer those over into, so I'm using L1 here to denote first language, is then easier to acquire those in your second language. So that's the first thing to say. I often use this concept of epistemic inclusion, and all it means is that it's about inclusion in meaning-making processes. So we often talk about different inclusion in different ways. And what I mean is that learners are actively engaged in making sense of the curriculum content. And epistemic inclusion really has two dimensions to it, which are interdependent. So one of those is about getting access to the formal curriculum as it has been specified. It'd be specified usually at the national level, and also schools may elaborate and specify curricula further at the school level. But it's also about recognizing the learners as knowers themselves, that they come into the classrooms with knowledge. And of course, very often that knowledge is expressed in their familiar languages. So they're expressing their knowledge in their L1. And you're not able to build on their previous learning unless you allow the students to be using L1. So those are some kind of basic principles that I would say of language and learning. So what about secondary education? Well, I think we saw from the poll that we just had, was it 82% of people, so everyone except all except for 2 people, were saying that secondary education in their context is using English. So overwhelmingly, secondary education tends to use an international language, a globally dominant language. And for secondary education has become kind of deeply associated with the uses of international languages. And we could go into the reasons for those. There's all sorts of reasons for those. Some of it is to do with resources. I mean, we were talking at primary education of the kind of cost implications of creating resources across many languages. Creating a secondary school textbook is very much more difficult than creating a reader for the early years. And very often, in a lot of contexts, countries are maybe dependent on textbooks that are being imported from elsewhere, or their textbook design is very much informed by the design of textbooks from elsewhere. So cost is definitely part of it. But there's also assumptions about what knowledge is valuable, and that knowledge can only be expressed in a kind of internationally dominant language. Now, sometimes this monolingualism in secondary education, sometimes quite often, we're not just talking about monolingual secondary schools, we're talking about secondary schools being violently monolingual. So, for example, a friend of mine, Lizzie Milligan, and colleagues at the University of Gulu did some research in northern Uganda, and they found there that schools were using very punitive practices. So they were punishing students for using any language other than English anywhere around the school compound. We also found in our research in Tanzania that around about half, we visited 16 schools, and around about half of them had these kind of punitive school policies. And this punishment could take violent form. So it might be the use of corporal punishment or the use of humiliation. And the other thing that we will talk about in this presentation is that the whole logic of the curriculum is monolingual. So learners are treated as if they were monolingual English. Of course, in other parts of the world, we might have been talking about Spanish, or we might have been talking about standardized Arabic, or French. In sub-Saharan Africa, also French or Portuguese, depending on where you are. So it's assumed, as students are treated as if the curriculum is designed as if the learners all along had only been speaking English, as if they were monolingual speakers. And as we were saying, with respect to this example from Northern Uganda, this is there seems to be this kind of almost this negative spiral, which is where monolingualism, this insistence on only using English, can be part of a kind of cycle of violence, where it silences learners in the classroom, which then creates conditions where teachers may be using transmissive pedagogies for other reasons to do with their skills or what they believe good teaching is. But it's all being supported by, it's all kind of the English only policy feeds into this. And then you also can end up with these violent schools. We talked about violent punishments. The other thing we found in our research in Tanzania is in these schools that were insisting on English only, that those students that had were less proficient in English were more vulnerable to bullying. So I'll go on now to talk more specifically about the context of Tanzania. I think it's fair enough to say that in Tanzania, that making universal lower secondary education universal, so available to everyone, as we were hearing from Priya, this is a policy ambition. It's very far from being something that's realized. If you're looking at the completion rates, when I talk about primary education is 7 years, lower secondary education is then 4 years. Primary education has recently changed to 6 years, but at the time we were doing this research, it was 7 years. The completion rates in primary education, well, they're not 100%, but they are the majority. In lower secondary education, it's much lower. It's around 30%. And of course, part of that is because some learners are not transitioning from primary education to lower secondary. And some of it is that they're dropping out as they go through secondary educations. Primary education in state-funded schools in Tanzania is primary schools is in Kiswahili. So private schools, which are predominantly in urban areas, are mainly English medium, but with the very few exceptions that you can probably count on one hand, the state-funded secondary primary schools use Kiswahili as the language of learning and teaching and assessment. And then in lower secondary education, there's quite an abrupt transition to using English. So there is a kind of 6-week orientation program for language, but that's about it. And after that, the ideal is that you continue on with using English as the language of instruction. But we did do research in schools, and we did look at teachers' pedagogies very closely, and we did interviews, and we spoke to students, and we also did interviews with teachers to kind of understand their attitudes. But actually, the most startling findings, which I'm going to talk about today, came from our analysis of the curriculum. And so our analysis of the curriculum was guided by this question: how do the language skills that are developed through primary education? So this is assuming the curriculum is working well, it's being delivered well. So if everything is working well and we took the curriculum as it was specified, there has been some changes to the curriculum since, but at the time we were doing the research, and you looked at the language skills that are developed through primary education, and you compared those with the language skills that you need to have to engage with the secondary school science in particular. We focused on science and we focused on the subject biology. So how do those compare? That was our question. We did the analysis in a couple of ways. So this is a kind of qualitative analysis where we looked at the kind of specified learning outcomes as they were specified in the curriculum documents. And then for a kind of further elaboration of those, we looked at the textbooks. So there's a set of textbooks that are published by the Tanzania Institute of Education, and all state-funded schools are supposed to use those textbooks, and those are presumably the textbooks that the most of all the textbooks that learners have access to. Most learners will have access, not necessarily all of learners, but more learners will have access to those textbooks than any others. So when we looked at grade 7 English, when we looked at these kind of descriptive data, what we found was that if all is going well and the child is achieving well against those specified objectives, and not all children will be, obviously, then by the time they've completed primary education, they will be basic users of English. And what this means is they still need some simplified language input, and they still need some structured support with using English. The English skills that are developed are mainly for kind of social communication. There isn't so much focus in this stage on English skills for using in academic contexts. When we came to looking at the grade 8 biology textbooks, what we found was the level was roughly around B2. So this is using the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So it's a kind of generic frame of reference for measuring the difficulty of languages that's been created, and is the most well-established one. So this is kind of the upper intermediate level, where learners can understand the main ideas of the complex text on both concrete and abstract topics, and they can produce clear, detailed text on a wide range of subjects. Now, there's a big gap between this A2 and this B2. So what this means is, if you're going to if you're a child who has everything going well for them, you're being well supported from home, you're doing well in school, and you go to a Kiswahili medium primary school, so a state-funded primary school, and then when you transition into secondary education, already you're facing a massive language demand gap. We also did some kind of quantitative lexical analysis where we took textbooks and we plugged them into, we kind of fed them into some software that then analyzes the kind of reading difficulty of those textbooks. And actually, when we did that, the findings were the gulf between the standard 7 English textbooks and the Form 1 biology textbook was even greater. And to give you an idea, I think here it's saying that the vocabulary range, if you look at the third line, which talks about the vocabulary range required to read the books with support, you can read the standard 7 English textbooks if you know 3,000 words in English with support. If you know 5,000 words in English, you can read them with ease. For the biology textbook, you would need to know 7,000 words in English in order to read it with support. Now, one of the colleagues on our team had done some previous research with first-year undergraduate students at his university and had found that they, on average, knew about 4,000 words of English. So we're saying that these biology textbooks, which are intended to be used in the first year of secondary school, would be hard to read, very hard to read, that students at one of the main largest universities in Tanzania would find it difficult to read those books. Yes. Kanchen, you've been commenting on the textbooks in grade 10 English textbooks are at B1, and the science. You've actually done similar. This is really interesting. You've done similar research in Maharashtra and found that actually got quite similar findings there as well for grade 10 textbooks. Very interesting. Thank you. So what Kanchen is saying is, this is a similar trend that they've observed or found through doing very similar research with textbooks in a state in India, Maharashtra. We didn't do quite such comprehensive analysis of textbooks for other subjects, but we did just take some kind of sample pages from those textbooks and plug them into this software. So out of interest, you know, is this just a problem for biology? Because science subjects, we know, have a lot of technical vocabulary. So it could be that there's some kind of you know, our reading, those indicators of readability are being kind of slightly, that they're becoming out particularly high just because there's a large amount of vocabulary within biology textbooks. However, when we looked at history, which is a subject where you don't have a high amount of technical vocabulary, we found that the reading difficulty actually came out as a bit higher. And for geography, it came out as higher still. So this appears to be a problem actually that's pretty much across the curriculum, even though we've only looked at one subject in detail. Now, what did we conclude, therefore, about whether students are prepared for secondary education, or whether they would be prepared for secondary education if everything was going well and they were following this curriculum? Yes. They are prepared, as it happened, with the language skills that you need for secondary education. It's just that they have those language skills in Kiswahili. So we also took a little look at the primary school curriculum for Kiswahili, and we saw that it was developing much more advanced language skills. So they were using and practicing and had mastering more complex vocabulary. Again, this is assuming everything is going well for a child with their primary school education and they're achieving against the specified learning outcomes. And actually, it looks like quite a lot of children are achieving against those outcomes. So 88% of this shows the results for the kind of end of primary national exams, and the pass rates in Kiswahili are close to 90%. For English, they're at about 34%. So even at that basic level of A2, only 35% of students are actually achieving that basic level. And that's out when you have a completion rate of 74%. So what we found was students don't have the language skills that you need for secondary education in English. They have developed the language skills, or a lot of them have developed the language skills in Kiswahili. And if they were continuing to use Kiswahili, they would be prepared for secondary education. I think something to remember when you have a language transition, we talk a lot about the costs of multilingual education, and we talk a lot about the costs of producing materials and the costs of training teachers for multilingual education. My background actually is not in language. My background, previous to becoming a researcher, I was a science and maths teacher. And I still care a lot more, care a lot about students' learning of science. And when you take this approach to transition, what was called subtractive language transition, where you completely remove the familiar language and you introduce a new language of learning and teaching, this comes at a cost to subject learning. Now, this is something that we observed in the lessons. So we saw that many teachers were using, in order to kind of engage the learners in some way, they were using a strategy of simplifying the science content and reducing it. And sometimes they were reducing it. Some teachers were reducing it to the point where this really was more like a grade 4 primary school lesson. And we're talking about students who are in grade 8. In terms of the science, they weren't learning anything new. They might have learned, they were learning like the names of animals in English. And that perhaps was the main learning that they took away from the lesson. And we know this from research that's done across the world, including with kind of internationally mobile young people. So they've moved from one education system into another education system where it then use another language of instruction. When you increase the language demand, the subject learning goes down, and you have to balance those. So if the language demand is high, then you have to reduce the subject learning. And so there's no way to do language transition, and most especially subtractive language transition, where the language demand is very high. There is no way to do language transition without a cost to subject learning. So language transition is making secondary education much harder. Another way I like to, somebody use this analogy for something else completely, but they use the analogy of an octopus, fitting an octopus back into a jar. And I like this analogy. And so one way of thinking about this is, we're saying the whole logic of the curriculum assumes that children have the skills, the language skills in English that they actually have in Kiswahili. It's this almost, as I was saying, this almost violently monolingual logic, where you just insist that English is the language of instruction, and therefore that's the language, the policy, and therefore that's what you're going to do. And Tanzanian society, like a lot of societies, the majority of societies around the world, is multilingual. And we keep trying to fit the kind of multilingual octopus. And I'm not just talking about individuals. We keep trying to fit like all of our children, all of our young people across society into these kind of monolingual jars, and they don't fit. And the reason I like this analogy is the thing about octopuses, they're very, very clever. And, you know, we have societies where our population of young people are very clever. They have amazing language skills, and yet we keep trying to fit them into this jar that doesn't work for them. So what are some ways that we can go forward from here? One, definitely, we need to be advocating for, and where we're involved in curriculum design, we need to be thinking about planning a coherent language learning journey. You've got to link up the language demands. Language learning can't just be something that happens in English language lessons only. You're acquiring different literacy skills in the different subjects of the curriculum. As the curriculum begins to split into other subjects towards upper primary, so usually from around grade 6 into lower secondary, then you're developing more specialized literacy skills. And you have to plan for language learning across the educational phases and across curriculum subjects. So that means that you're practicing grammar in the English language subject before you're expected to use it in other subjects. You're integrating language support into subject learning, and you only gradually increase the complexity of the text that students are expected to engage with. Number 2, we need to design teaching and learning materials for the learners we have. Not for the learners that we've kind of made up, but for the learners we have. So we need teaching and learning materials for multilingual learners. And we've done a lot of this work. John Clegg here has been a leader in this work. And he's really shown all of us working in this team the kind of ways that you can do this. We have some examples of materials. So the link that is working is there, and there's a QR code if you want to have a look at those materials. And you can see some of the features, but it includes integrating support for developing language skills across subjects. It's still part of being a subject teacher. Part of being a subject teacher is a language teacher. You can't separate those two things. And then number 3, and this is a project that Zawadi was involved in, who is here, as well as Elikim Sane, who's been involved in all of this work, who is here. Develop the multilingual pedagogical skills of teachers through teacher education. We actually saw some pretty amazing, in our lesson observations, we actually saw some pretty amazing teaching, and we saw some multilingual teaching. This is just one example. It was actually the minority of schools. It was just under half the schools where biology teachers would not use Kiswahili at all in the classroom. But a lot of teachers were not allowing students to use their familiar languages in the classroom. But there were some teachers, even from our small sample of 16, who had some amazing amazing practices that they were using. So the expertise is there within the education system, but it needs to be systematically developed, including through, and most especially through, teacher education. I'm actually going to end the presentation there, if that's okay. Ajay, I'm just having a look at the questions in the chat. Do you want me to kind of talk to those first before we go into breakout groups?
Sure. No, I think it's a good time to take questions also, because like language projects often leave us with more questions than answers. I'm sure there are questions, how will these 1, 2, 3 be achieved also, and what is the complexity of across context? But we'll open the floor for questions. We can have 10 minutes and then go into breakout and then come back again for more questions and discussion. So yeah.
Great. Okay, so Meg was saying that officially English is the language of instruction in secondary school in Somaliland, as well as Somali being used. Yeah, that happens quite a lot, that where English is the official language of instruction, but it just doesn't work very well. Then a lot of teachers are having to improvise strategies that are multilingual, so that is happening. Is this huge assumption expectation gap? Ajay, you were asking whether the assumption, do you want to ask me that question directly?
I think this is more for the group as well. So when they go into the breakout rooms, because would love to ask, everyone to share about their context. Is this assumption, and because it seems like when you mentioned in Tanzania, the assumption is that the students need to know this, and the expectation is that, that they need to understand biology and be able to read at B1 and C1 levels. But is this gap is so huge. So is this true across our context, or is it unique something about Tanzania? I know it's similar in Pakistan.
Yeah. And Sabrish, you're describing quite a different context. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who taught grade 6 and grade 7, where students were just coming right out of primary schools, so I was notice government schools in Tamil Nadu are slowly transitioning to being English medium, for instance, and there's quite a lot of efforts in terms of both teacher training, changing of materials, things like that. But then I'm quite not yet sure to what extent these kind of considerations are in place at the state level. And so yeah, so one is that, and a tangential question, Professor, is you mentioned something around the common European framework for reference for language that you've used. Are there anything, are there any other similar frameworks that could be, that are available as well, which would be useful to look at? So I'm also planning to look at this, but predominantly from a global south perspective, that might be more contextually relevant.
Yeah, so I should have said we use the Common European Framework of Reference is a well-established scale, but in order to kind of apply it in this context, we use Pearson has developed what it calls the Global Scale of English, which is got a lot more detail in it, and that's where those descriptors came from. And they've developed it for. They've also kind of developed a version of it for different types of language learners. So we were using the one for young learners, that worked best for primary education. And then when it came to the secondary education, we actually found that it was the one for academic purposes. So I think they called it for academic learning, which is really kind of aimed at about 14 plus, but we found that was kind of provided, was a better fit for the types of learning outcomes that were specified in the secondary school. So yeah, the Pearson Global Scale of English has some great resources. They've been designed for kind of international schools, those types of contexts. I think the work needs to be done to adapt them more contextually to different contexts. But for this purposes, they definitely generated some insight. I don't know whether.
Yeah, there are two questions. One is by Kanupriya. Kanupriya, I think this was discussed in the earlier session as well. Happy to share the recording as well. But I think this is the question around when the home language is different from the first language or the language of the majority. What do you do exactly?
Yeah. So actually, this picture that we've got up here, this is a picture that Ellie Kim Sarnig took, who's here with us, so he might want to say something about it. But this is a classroom in a school that's serving Maasai children from Maasai communities. And so their home language is the Maasai language, it's called Ma, and it's very different from Kiswahili. It's not a Bantu language. And this teacher in this classroom himself speaks Ma, and he speaks Kiswahili, and he speaks English. So the teacher is trilingual. And what he actually did was drew on knowledge that he knew the students had of their local environment, but they would be expressing normally. So they had very detailed, it was a lesson about plants, and they had very detailed knowledge of the plants in their environment, way beyond what's actually covered in the syllabus. And he was able to elicit that knowledge from them. So he was inviting them to name plants in their first language, their main language. And then they were having conversations about it in Kiswahili. But he was writing, you know, this was to the point where he's legitimizing their language by inviting them to write words on the board and himself writing words on the board in their language. So I would try to use this kind of phrase, this term, familiar languages, throughout. And of course, there are contexts where students are coming into the classrooms with different home languages. And there's some great work being done in South Africa where they're showing how they're developing strategies for classrooms where learners have different home languages. So, for example, for some activities, they'd be splitting learners into groups according to their language. Obviously, the teacher may not know all of those languages themselves. So that they have some time to kind of process information in their home language before they're then asked to kind of express it in the kind of main language that's being used in the classroom. This idea of translanguaging, where you're very deliberately inviting students to maybe presenting information in one language and then giving them an opportunity to express it in another language. It's a quite deliberate strategy that has been observed and developed over many years across many different contexts. And it's, teachers that use it are saying that it improves the understanding of the subject. Remember, their objective isn't just about speaking English better. That may be the English teacher's objective. Their objective is that these children are able to understand and articulate their understanding of the science. And what they're saying is this deepens their understanding of the subject. And that's why I was saying L1 is an asset for learning. Even when it's a language that hasn't been used, or isn't kind of an official language of learning and teaching in formal education. Yes.
Yeah, technology.
Technology, yeah. Oh man, please, I'm waiting to see this for the textbooks. I really am. Have a play around with ChatGPT. If you speak a minoritized language or a non-dominant language, go to ChatGPT and try it out. Ask it, can you explain respiration in a way that's appropriate for a 13-year-old child or something like that in Kiswahili? We've tried it out. It came out with a pretty good explanation, actually. But we also tried it out with a language that has very few speakers. That was Seshawa. And it was pretty good in Seshawa as well. So AI could really revolutionize that whole process of producing materials if it's used in the correct way in the right hands. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Can we take this at a juncture? What I'll do is we will, before going into the breakout room, let's have maybe see each other first, so that when you go into the breakout rooms, you can show each other your faces as well when you're speaking.
Shall I stop sharing? So it's
Yeah. Great. So I'll count from 5 to 1. Thank you, Kanupriya, for taking the lead. And by 1, let's have a picture together. So 5, 4, 3, I can go slow, 2, with 1.5, and then 1 and 0. Here we go. Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me share the question for the breakout room. Why do we do breakout rooms? Is because I think there's just so much an opportunity, not for one speaker to share, but just so much to learn from each other. So in your context, when you go into breakout rooms, you'll be in groups of 3 or 2 or 4. In your context, how do you navigate the language transition journey for students in their secondary years? You could also talk about what could you resonate from what Dr. Angeline shared from Tanzanian context, what is different, what is similar. And if you had to think about how we had to actualize these 1, 2, 3 questions or possibilities which were raised, how can we do that in your context? Maybe you're already practicing something which the group can learn from. Yeah, thank you. I will put this question in the chat box as well and place you in a 15-minute breakout room.
Oh, great. So that means the videos were on. That's a good sign. Because in a virtual world, it just becomes difficult to connect otherwise. So thank you very much. I can start from what our group shared, and then, if you guys can share what came up. Because many a times when we discuss, there's a lot of helplessness of feeling when we talk about language. I don't know what you take away, but many a times when we've been in the room for multilingualism, there is this thing that the language should be there, but the helplessness of, oh, there is so many problems, oh, it's so complicated. I think one question which we were discussing is, while secondary education is so complex, as the access, as Kanupriya mentioned, and then all the issues and the quality challenges and so on and so forth, and the upward transition, is language a place where we can soothe things, or is it adding further complexity the way we are choosing to work with it? And I think that's where we were discussing that currently it seems like it is adding further complexity, because students are really, while they are in it, it's very difficult for them to even make it to secondary in the first place. And when they're in it, while we know that they may not have the capacity to be in a to have the skills which they have in their familiar language, but not in English, but we are imposing upon them somewhere to study science and maths. On the other hand, are we readying them for transition beyond secondary? Is language only a barrier? Are we readying them right now as well? So I think that was the contradictions which are coming up. And it'll be really great to hear what you thought, and in your group, what came up. We had Rodaf from Somalia. We had, Ilya Kemu from Nigeria, and Tanzania. And then we had Susan from Nigeria. So it was really nice and interesting to have that group. Thank you.
I
Would
think I can share from my group. So we had Meg and Nazia from BRAC. So I think we shared a little bit about personal experiences through language. More so, I think Nazia shared about being from Bangladesh, her learning was always in the local language predominantly for the largest part. And English was something that was picked up over the time, as well as what the organization is doing in Uganda, as well as in Bangladesh. I think one interesting takeaway for us, I think if you look at language acquisition as in two stages, which typically it's seen, which is learning to read and then reading to learn. The learning to read stage, it seems, at least from the development economics, education economics space that I'm coming from, it seems like that the push is towards having that acquired in the early years per se, the grade 1 to 3 part of it per se, and using some of the evidences like differentiated instruction, teaching at the right level, or structured pedagogy. I, however, the emphasis is still on English language acquisition. So Meg shared this very interesting point around it's probably better for a learner to probably learn the local language first, using some of these strategies, and then use some of those techniques to acquire English as a language, which I thought was pretty interesting.
We had Amrita, Pri, Christine in one group. Would anyone want to share from that group?
I can share quickly. So we didn't have a chance to actually discuss the questions in much detail because we spent some time introducing ourselves, giving each other a bit of context about what we do. But I think a common thread that emerged was definitely that our initiatives mostly focus on the organizations that we work in. We focus on like primary education, and we've all recognized the challenge that as children are being taught in one language in primary schooling, and then as they transition to secondary schooling, that language changes. And then like we didn't get a chance to discuss this in detail, but I think Eleni had mentioned that in Zambia that they would be changing the language of instruction to English. And talk briefly about the challenges associated with that. Eleni, if there's anything you want to add there, let me know.
Summarize it well. I saw a lot of faces cringe or nod. That also explains enough. Thank you, Amrita.
Thank you. And we had Liz, Kanupriya, and Nelly.
I'm happy to mention one point, and then others from the group can jump in if I've missed anything. One point that came up in our discussion was just around the power dynamics of English, being a language of instruction in secondary education, and how that's tied to colonial histories in a lot of countries in the global South. And just market dynamics as well. Kanupriya had a good example of that in India, which I'll let her speak to if she wants to. Can probably do it better than I can.
No, I was mentioning how parents equate English with better quality. It's just a proxy in people's heads. And so there's been masses of children that are left the government system for a very poor quality private system. Which claims that English is the medium of instruction, but actually when you go into those schools, they're not doing anything different because the teachers they have are really no different from the government system. So the packaging and the trappings are all English, but actually when you look at instruction in the classroom, it's still in the shared language. So maybe they have more nursery rhymes or more singing or assembly or the notice boards or, there's lots of visible signs of English, but the pedagogy is actually still very much rooted in L1. So, but just the market of that and how that has pushed governments to now start to transition to English as medium of instruction in secondary as well as now in primary. We were hearing from Nelly how Tanzanian government is starting to do a handful of experiments with English in the primary, or states in India that are now opening English medium primary and secondary schools to combat this competition from the market. We also spoke a little bit about, what you were saying, Angeline, about AI and how in 5 years we might be having a very different conversation as both children and teachers learn to use AI to support them in their language transition.
Yeah. It's interesting, Angeline, that there are two sides to it. On one end, we are saying how we can become more multilingual and how we can use technology and how we can use pedagogical methods or bilingual textbooks, which you will share soon also about it, that how we can use those. But on the other hand, at a policy level, there is the simplification approach also that, okay, make it monolingual from primary and this problem will be resolved. From your research and understand, will this problem be resolved or do we need to see it as a problem? How have you seen it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. Actually, there was a little element of comparison to what we're doing because, we were conducting the research at a time when, in Tanzania mainland, they were transitioning to English in grade 8. However, we also did some research in Zanzibar. So Zanzibar kind of has its own primary education system. And they were they're using English for some subjects from grade 5. And one of those subjects is science. So it's science, maths, geography, and I think IT. So we also did some vocabulary assessments. So we assessed students' knowledge of scientific vocabulary in English. And we found that the students in the schools in Zanzibar had less knowledge of scientific vocabulary in English than students in the schools in mainland Tanzania. But they're supposed to have had 3 years of learning science in English. So I think sometimes what might work well for not a low-cost private education, but for a kind of higher quality of private education, where they're able to bring in teachers who are fluent in English and they have more resources. And then, yes, using English from the beginning works great in those schools. But it doesn't necessarily work when you try doing it at scale in the government system because you just don't have the resources. And I think, Priya, you're making a similar point about the low-fee private schools in India. You don't have the resources to do this English medium earlier on. It just introducing it earlier, there are no benefits for it. I think too often we have to be really careful about how we talk about this. So it's very easy to take our findings and to look at the findings from that curriculum analysis, for example, and say students are not prepared for English medium secondary education. And then everyone goes, oh, so what we need to do is start with English earlier. So I was very careful not to say that and to put it in the positive way, because there is a positive story to tell. It so happens that in the Tanzanian education system that most people completing primary school do have the language skills for secondary education, if only it were in Kiswahili. So we have to be very careful about how we talk about this, because there is this pressure, this assumption that if you just introduce English earlier and earlier, then your children will be better at English. Actually changing a whole education system to start using English earlier is a big thing. It has to be really carefully planned. And, like I said, the student, as you're saying, you're talking about teachers who have these great skills for teaching using students L1. And some teachers have great skills for not all, but some teachers have great skills for multilingual education. You can't overnight take primary school teachers who are used to teaching, or early years teachers who are used to teaching in one language, and say use English instead and expect it to work smoothly. That's, you always have to plan years in ahead for a change of that scale. So those are things we need to be really careful about, I think. Yeah. The power dynamics, that's so true. And I'm always aware when I give these presentations that here I am sat in UK. I had this enormous privilege. I had all of my education in my mother tongue, in my first language. And actually, when I did get, the first language I was introduced to in school happened to be was a minoritized language. It was Welsh, because I just happened to be living in Wales at the time. And then I have the privilege of talking to you all across different parts of the world, as you are, using my mother tongue. That's an enormous privilege that I can't take for granted, but it's not necessarily normal.
Great. I'm sure this discussion can go on, and I know you have other things to get onto, but do think about it. I'm sharing a poll over here as well. Please do give us feedback on how we can strengthen these sessions, how we can strengthen the dialogue. Don't go away after the poll. Maybe we can, do a 1-2 questions together and then wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes, hello. I'm
Yes,
trying
Christy.
to, yes, I'm trying to submit, but it is not accepting. I'm wondering what the challenge could be.
No worries. What I'll do is I'll send you the questions in email. If
Oh,
that
okay.
struggle, Christy, no worries.
Christine, did you scroll down? Because there's like, if you scroll down and answer all the questions, I think you'll be able to submit, but it is wanting you to go all the way down to the bottom.
Thank you so much. I hadn't scrolled down.
Okay, perfect. While others are filling it, Angeline, a question for you given that, we are a community of practitioners and now there's a lot of encouragement to do an MNE within the practitioner community as well. From a language researcher perspective, if we had to, as a community of practitioners had to adopt better practices to understand what is working, what can be done from the language transition journey to understand where we are and what are the next steps to take?
I think, based on the presentation today, one of the things is to kind of take a very close look at the curriculum that you've given. Very often we don't have a lot of choice. We're given a curriculum at the state level, and we assume that curriculum will work. And actually just bother to stop and look at it. I was surprised when we started doing this research. The amount of classroom research that has been done in Tanzania, there's loads of it. But very few people seem to have sat down and looked carefully at the textbooks or looked carefully at the curriculum documents. They just assume that they're okay, that they work fine. So, I'd say, yeah, we tend to do monitoring and evaluation down. But you can also do it up and have a look at what are the system level constraints with which you're working. And then you might understand what's happening with teachers' practice.
Thank you. Yes, Kanapriya.
I really like what you just said, Dr. Barrett. I think also to consider the politics of language particular to that context. Because in Tanzania, Swahili is part of their national identity. It's how they've built up, ground up as an independent country, their identity as a nation. And it's almost politically incorrect to mention that there are other familiar languages. And how do you then navigate that by, in a positive, additive way? And so in our work in early learning, we're focusing on transition to Swahili rather than saying bring other languages into the classroom. We're saying these children will do better if they can transition to Swahili better. And a lot of those children in that picture are the children that we're working with when they're 5 years old. So, so I think that's another important. We assume that the politics of language is clear cut, and it may not be.
That's a beautiful, beautiful remark, Kunupriya, because I think that's what we found in Pakistan when we were doing the research as well. And now with with everything being at the intersection, we see that family engagement is so crucial, not only for language learning or other learning, but even for child safeguarding and for safety and security. So I think, but when parents and grandparents will only or largely speak in the language which is familiar to them, are we cutting them off fully? So I think there's just so many other lenses we must adopt while we're thinking at a policy level or at a community or school network level, which it just gets often missed.
So at the moment, I'm editing a special issue which has about 24 different contributions. It's a NORAG special issue, so they're very short contributions and hopefully this will be out by March and we'll be able to share it with you. But one of those contributions was about language-friendly schools. So there's the Language-Friendly Schools Network, and I think it's such a great concept. So the idea is that the school is welcoming of all the languages that are spoken by the school community, and that's a really broad idea of a school community, and how that, I think that's what you're talking about, Ajay. How if you start welcoming the community languages within the school, all sorts of other things then become improved. That language is part of everything else. And I think, some of these dead ends we get into when we're debating language is that we're not making the connections to the other things. And when you talk about child safeguarding, a language-friendly schools, such a strong step towards doing that. When you're talking about transmissive pedagogies, loosening up on rules, like just forget about that English only rule, and then already you're taking a step towards more participative pedagogies. When you're talking about violent schools, I mentioned that. Again, it's removing the English only rule may not solve everything, but it's a step that we know how to take, and we know quite a lot about multilingual pedagogy. When you talk about education for sustainability, actually generating knowledge that will be used in the communities where the schools are, and again, welcoming L1 into the classrooms, your education is going to be so much more relevant for sustainable development in those communities. So I think it's part of so many other things. And I don't think it's a switch where if you get language right, everything else would be right. But I think it's always going to be a step in the right direction. And some of those other things are really hard to do, but actually we do know quite a lot about language.
There's a reason why we say it's a medium. I think it's a language in itself. Thank you so much, Dr. Angeline, for giving your time and energy, and thank you for coming and joining the GSF community. And thank you everyone for joining in from at different time zones. I know it's very late in India as well, in different parts of the world. So just wanted to quickly share that GSF does a lot of other things in terms of Evidence Hub. There's a ECED Evidence Hub, innovative partnership between government and non-state actors. You can click on the resources page of GSF website to learn more or connect with us. There are a lot of resources out there on all hands on deck. Childcare, child safeguarding toolkit has been recently updated. They have a separate community of practice on secondary education. But yeah, overall, thank you so much for joining in. It was really, really great to have each one of you join us.
Can I say, Ajay, just a special thanks to you as well, because to be skillfully chaired is so enriching for this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, day, morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.